we want to begin tonight with Mitch, with the opinion from the court. So, Mitch, you've been reading through the state Supreme Court ruling. What have you learned?
Natalie, it was a 4-3 decision, and the majority opinion of Justice D. Arthur Kelsey turns on when early voting began last fall and when the amendment was proposed. Early voting began on September 19th of last year, and the amendment wasn't proposed in the General Assembly until more than a month later. In the opinion, State Supreme Court Justice D. Arthur Kelsey writes that between the beginning of early voting and the introduction of the amendment, more than 1.3 million votes have been cast in the general election. That was approximately 40% of the total vote for that election cycle. So with their ruling, the justices say those 1.3 million early voters had a right to know about the amendment before they cast their ballot, but they couldn't possibly have known because of the timing. So as a result, they had no idea how the people they were voting for or against felt about the amendment, and that is why this amendment process was overturned. The opinion goes on to say early Virginia voters unknowingly forfeited their constitutionally protected opportunity to vote for or against delegates who favor or disfavor amending the Constitution by not anticipating a legislative vote on a constitutional amendment 4 days before the last day of voting, end quote. The ruling notes that since 1971, there have been 63 proposed constitutional amendments in Virginia, all of them proposed before general voting began. This is the first time an amendment was proposed after voting began. Natalie?
Yeah, so Mitch, could this be a decision that could be appealed up to the U.S. Supreme Court then?
It could be appealed, but it's unlikely the court would hear it. And that's because back in 2019, the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, decided the federal courts have no jurisdiction when it comes to state legislatures drawing their districts. It was a 5-4 decision. The case is known as Rucho versus Common Cause, and Chief Justice Roberts, writing for the majority, said the framers left that power in the hands of state legislatures and that federal courts have no place in the process.
All right, Mitch Carr, thank you so much.
Welcome back to WDBJ 7 News at 5:30. The big news of the day, the months-long redistricting effort in Virginia has been struck down by the Commonwealth Supreme Court. And here to talk about it, we've got our senior reporter, Joe DeShiel, as well as Virginia Tech professor and political analyst, Casey Myers. And Joe, I want to start with you first. Sure. You said Republicans might have had some optimism ahead of this decision. Why would that be?
I would say cautiously optimistic. It was because of that ruling in the Tazewell County Circuit Court, or at least the Supreme Court's ruling about the Tazewell County case. Judge down in Tazewell County had blocked the certification of the referendum. The Supreme Court refused to vacate that decision. And so I think Republicans had some optimism that the decision would go in their favor today, but you never know how these things are going to go until the ruling comes out. So cautiously optimistic, but maybe not totally confident.
Well, and Joe, so from a Republican perspective, sigh of relief or dancing on tables? What's the level of excitement here for Republicans? I
would imagine some are on both sides of that equation. Of course, they're obviously very happy about the result. Again, confident or optimistic again, but not confident until that ruling came down. Sometimes you try to read the tea leaves, whether it's with that previous ruling by the Supreme Court on the Tazewell County case, or perhaps the oral arguments, what the judges were saying during oral arguments. Mm-hmm. But you never really know until that ruling comes down. That can be tricky trying to make a prediction ahead of time. So until the decision came down, I think people were just kind of waiting to see how it was going to go. Now they are celebrating.
And Casey, over to you now. You not only are a political expert and an analyst for us here at WDBJ7, you have a law degree. You know more about reading these decisions than the laymen of us out here. So you noticed that the first 10 or so pages of this was a little bit different. Can you explain that to me?
Well, in an appellate decision, you're always going to have a statement of the facts that comes at the beginning of the decision. But this statement really gave a perspective, and you took away from it that there was a long historical arc that was going on here, talking about the colonial era, talking about democracy, and a real criticism of gerrymandering as a concept. And so that gives a little bit of an insight. While that's not really part of the decision in terms of how they made that decision, it certainly gave a perspective, I think, of those in the majority of maybe how they saw this process. And so it was interesting to read that going into the larger discussion of the legal issues.
And so we got about 30 seconds left here, but did you view this, as the Attorney General of Virginia, Jay Jones, did, as a pretty nakedly political decision? That's what he said, but I wanted to know if your reading of it, that you felt like it was politically motivated rather than just, on the facts of the case.
I think that in any situation like this, the side that loses is going to make that conversation that point, and they're going to be talking about the politics and the implications here. But again, this really ended up being a discussion largely around what does elections mean, what is election day versus the election process, and the legal analysis around that.
And that is just the tip of the iceberg. We have a lot more to come on the WDBJ7 News at 6. Welcome back, everybody. We're now bringing in our senior reporter, Joe DeShiel, and Casey Myers, a professor at Virginia Tech and a political analyst. And Casey, I'm going to start with you. This obviously was a victory for the Republicans here in the Commonwealth and really nationwide. But here locally, where do the Virginia Democrats go after this?
Well, I think that they're going to continue to talk about making this election a referendum on Donald Trump. I think they're going to talk about how Democrats are really leaning into affordability in 2026 and moving forward. I think nationally this becomes an impact for the House of Representatives, obviously, but how that shakes out just kind of remains to be seen. We have other states that are doing these similar types of redrawing.
And we're going to get to national politics in just a minute, but first I want to talk to you, Joe, about the long-term impacts, because we're talking about 2026 and what Virginia Democrats do from here. Sure. But long-term, what is the impact here on both parties?
Well, we're going to have to see how it plays out, of course. But there's been a lot of speculation today that Democrats may try to do this again for the 2028 election, which they would have more time to make the the changes that need to be made to make that work this time around. Long term, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out in terms of this intense partisan divide in the state and whether this tends to fuel that even further.
Yeah, it has gotten a bit more partisan. I think everybody can agree on that. Now, Casey, when it comes to Virginia's place in the national conversation, we've already seen Tennessee move to redraw its maps. There was a Supreme Court decision involving Louisiana, which I'd love you to discuss with us, and then Florida as well. So where does Virginia fit or not fit into that entire national discussion about redrawing boundaries?
Well, I think it fits into the larger math. And what is the math going to look like for Republicans, and what is it going to look like for Democrats in these redrawn districts? Now, what you're talking about with Louisiana is a separate sort of issue. It's about the Voting Rights Act Section 2 and how that has allowed for maybe some redrawing in certain states. Again, this is also coming up against this timeline of there's primary season, there's going to be a general election, and so the time it takes to maybe redraw this is running out. So nationally, we'll see that play out, and we may see this continue to play out after 2026 going into 2028.
And Joe, when it comes to national politics, it seems like throughout this debate, Republicans have looked at this as a Virginia issue. Right. Democrats have looked at this as we need to act because other states are acting.
Right.
So going forward, do you have any sense of what the part that Virginia has to play in the national discussion and whether both parties are going to see themselves as part of the national discussion or stay out of it?
Well, I can tell you today we were definitely part of the national discussion. Newscasts, we were the lead story. Going forward, I think Virginia will continue to be a major player in that whole discussion, even though we are not doing what a lot of other states are doing in terms of the redistricting. But again, we'll have to see how that plays out with what happens here in Virginia, both in the next election cycle and beyond that. Of course, Democrats have promised that we'll go back to that independent redistricting commission at some point, perhaps after the 2030.
That's right. This was supposed to be temporary. That was written into the amendment. And so, Casey, let me turn to you now. 2028 and beyond. We talked about how gerrymandering is not actually illegal. It happens all the time. It's been happening for as long as this country's had districts. So do you see further gerrymandering or the attempt to gerrymander continuing on and on and on? Or will we reach a point where we do go back to, hey, let's just draw these things as fairly as possible?
I think that's really a question that voters may be facing in the future, looking at who they elect in their state legislatures, and it's made state legislatures that much more important in this conversation. But looking at this from a kind of a historical perspective, while gerrymandering has always been kind of part of American history and politics, having these redrawn districts before the census is something that is quite unusual. And now that we've had that happen in multiple states, I think that this really opens the door up for maybe this to be a new political norm in the United States, and we may see this happening year after year.
Well, go ahead, Joe.
Well, I just have one point to add to that. Speaking with Morgan Griffith today, he said that perhaps there is room for Congress to act on these mid-decade redistrictings and perhaps put some limits on that. So I think that's going to be part of the discussion going ahead as well, whether we even allow these mid-decade redistricting.
Well, you know, in 2019, this U.S. Supreme Court decided in Rucho versus Common Cause, we're not getting into this. Can Congress do that? Can you have the national Congress come in and say, here's what you can and can't do, states? I know this is not something I prepped you on, but I'm curious.
Yeah.
There's always that possibility that they may attempt, but I would suspect that there'd be legal challenges around that, as there always is with that type of issue with federalism. But again, that may be a solution. This is something, again, we're in a kind of an unprecedented political reality in the last few years, looking at this kind of thing from, instead of every 10 years looking at it every year, and then this kind of back and forth between Republicans and Democrats trying to get this net advantage on the math at the end of the day.
A constant state of redistricting. That is going to be exhausting for the electorate. Joe, do you feel that way?
No question about it. I mean, we're in this hyper-partisan time right now, and that will only make it even worse.
Casey, you just need a break.
We're never at a loss of things to talk about.
You know, it's Friday. It is Mother's Day weekend. This decision has come down. I do hope, though, that we will be able to take a break from this. We'll come back at it on Monday. Enjoy your Mother's Day. Gentlemen, thank you very much for coming in and discussing this. And we're going to have more news on Your News at 6. We're going to take a look at